Good evening. There we go. Good evening. Good evening. It's good to see everybody out tonight. I am glad to be back in class and studying John chapter 2 with y'all. I was asked earlier where we were tonight, and I said we're right here. And I thought that was pretty evident, but where we are in the text is in John 2. I've been accused 8 times tonight of wearing a Kentucky shirt, all by people who have lived in Martin all their life. And so, I'm not on? Now, can you hear me now? Can you hear me now? Start all over. Hey, how y'all doing tonight? I am glad to be here and glad to see all of y'all. We are in John chapter 2. I've been accused 8 times tonight of having Kentucky blue on by people who were born and raised in Martin. And I told them, I said, if you don't know the Westview colors by now, clearly this is not Kentucky blue. It's Westview blue. I mean, anybody can tell that. My brother, of course, is a Kentucky fan. And there may be others in here tonight. And if there are, then we'll offer an invitation later on for you. But every time he says go big blue, I tell him, I say, you know what blue is a synonym for? He said, what's that? And I said, sad, downhearted, all the bad kind of things. So, but Westview blue is a different kind of idea. So anyway, we are in John chapter 2, and we're going to begin with a little bit of a review, since it's been a couple of weeks since we have been studying in John together. You remember, hopefully you remember, in chapter 1, I'm going to write this up here so that it helps me remember and maybe helps you remember a little bit. But in chapter 1, we began in chapter 1 by finding out, of course, let me back up. I got ahead of myself. The verses that you have to remember when you study the Gospel of John that tells you what the purpose of the book is all about is what? John 20, 30 through 31. My mama got it right, so I'm proud of her. So, John 20 through 30 through 31, he says that many other signs truly did Jesus, which are not written in this book, but these are written. This is why I have written this book, so that you might believe that Jesus is the Christ, and believing in Jesus as the Christ will allow you to, or the Messiah, the Anointed One, will allow you to have life. And so we started off in chapter 1 with that the beginning 13, 14 verses or so, where he talks about how that Jesus is the Word and He is God. You remember he talked about in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and everything was created by Him, and nothing was created without Him. And then he spends a couple of verses over on John, who was going. Remember, he talked about life and light being connected with the Word, and then he talks about John. He says he was not the true light, but he was there to make way for the true light. The true light was Jesus, and then you get to about verse 13 or 14, and he gives you that whammy verse of the Word became flesh and dwelt among men, and we beheld His glory. Glory is the only begotten of God. And that's when they would have said, whoa, wait a minute now. And so that's how he began. And then we saw a little bit more about John and what his mission was. And you remember that John had that awakening, that realization of who Jesus was really, because of God the Father telling him that whoever God the Spirit descended on would be God the Son. And so that happened at the baptism of Jesus, and the witness or the testimony of John begins as he begins telling people. Remember the religious leaders come to John, and they want him to talk about him, but all he wants to talk about is Jesus. And ultimately he points his disciples to Jesus, and he says, behold, what? The Lamb of God that takes away the sins of the world. So the second thing we find out in chapter 1 is that He is the Lamb of God. And one of those disciples was Andrew. And Andrew said, before I follow Him, let me go get my brother. And he gets Simon, and they begin following. And then they come across Philip and tell him who Jesus is. Remember, we talked about that finding and following. When you find out who Jesus is, you want to follow Him, and you want to find somebody else to follow along with you. And they found Philip. They tell him about it. And Philip says, before I follow, let me go tell Nathanael. And he goes to Nathanael, and he says, we have found the one we've been waiting for. It's Jesus, the son of Joseph of Nazareth. And he said, kind of smugly, he says, can any good thing come out of Nazareth? You got to be joking, right? That was one of those, what you talking about, Willis, kind of moments in the Gospel of John. And there's several of them. And he says, come and see. Remember that phrase that we talked about and how important that was. And so Nathanael walks up and Jesus says, yep, you were sitting under a tree before you came. And he says, well, you must be the Holy One from God. And Jesus says, if that impresses you, you hadn't seen nothing yet. And this is the Corey Standard version, of course, of that passage. But that's what he says, is you think that's something. You hadn't seen nothing yet. What you're going to see is angels ascending and descending on the Son of Man. And, of course, we talked about how that in that text, he's showing us that he is Jacob's ladder. Jacob's ladder. If I misspell something because I'm going too fast or because I don't know how to spell something, then just go along with me, okay? He's Jacob's ladder. Remember, we talked about that connection between earth and heaven and how that connected with back in Jacob's ladder and the vision that he had, the dream he had, and how that even connected with the temple and the stairs and those kinds of things. So chapter 1 establishes some things about who Jesus is. In fact, chapter 1 makes a lot of really big claims about who Jesus is. And if the point of an introduction of a story or a book or whatever it might be is to get your attention, chapter 1 does that. It really grabs your attention and makes you stop and think, man, this is some big claims. Now can you back it up? And that's what he's going to start doing in chapter 2. So in chapter 2, we talked about 3 weeks ago, I guess it's been now, we talked about the first of those signs. And so I've got this little box here. Chapters 2 through 4 is interesting because what he's going to do is he's going to tell some things that happen, some different windows into Jesus' time in his ministry. He's actually going to keep doing that in the subsequent chapters, but we'll talk about that later. But there will be something that will happen, and I've told you about how that it's kind of like onion layers, you know. There's the what happened, and then there's the meaning behind what happened, and then there's like these connections to Old Testament principles that is like the Matrix. It's about level 27 or 53 or whatever, you know. But even beyond that, there's these kind of groupings that we have. So in chapters 2 and 4, we've got really these really important Jewish institutions that Jesus is going to, as he's teaching and acting, show them I'm bigger than that. That you've fallen so in love with these institutions and these traditions and the way things happen, and you fail to really see what the really important part of this is, the big picture is, the covenant side of things are. So in chapter 2, we saw a wedding, and that was very important to the culture of the Jewish people. We talked about that a couple of weeks ago. And Jesus is at a wedding, and they're focused on one thing, and Jesus is going to help them to see who he is. In fact, kind of the punchline, I've told you all of these signs that, again, 30 through 31 talks about. The signs are not always miraculous. We're going to see that tonight. But all the miracles were signs. Not all the signs were miraculous. But they all have this deeper spiritual meaning to them. And in John, they kind of have like a punchline is the way that I would express it, I guess. That it's kind of that one statement that really drives home the point. So in John chapter 2, when Jesus changes the water to wine at the wedding, kind of the punchline of it all was that Jesus is the best saved for last. Remember, that was what the guy who was in charge of the wedding feast, that's what he said about the wine. You've saved the best for last. And that's what God has done. Think about all of the prophets that he has sent to his people. Well, Jesus is a prophet. He saved the best for last. Think of all the kings that God has put over his people. Jesus is a king, and he's the best for last. All the judges that God has sent to his people. Jesus is a judge, and he's the best for last. All these different ways that you can look at and think about Jesus. He's the best that God sent at the last to show His mercy and His grace. And so we get that in chapter 2. We'll just put 2a and 2b is what we're going to talk about tonight. And the big thing that the Jewish institution that he's going to talk about tonight is the temple. Now, have we talked about any kind of temple terminology so far as we've studied? John, do you remember any? Where was that at? We have a couple of times actually, but can you remember one of them? What, have we talked about any kind of temple terminology so far as we've been studying the Gospel of John? I kind of flew over one a few minutes ago. Pardon? Well, in Genesis is where we see the kind of the start of what the temple is all about. The temple, we talked about that a couple of weeks ago, how that the temple is kind of basically a reproduction of God's throne room, which is basically what the Garden of Eden was a reproduction of God's throne. But you remember, again, whenever he's talking about Jacob's ladder and that joining of earth and heaven, that bridge between earth and heaven, we talked about how that's what the temple was. So there's been that kind of hint at it. But even more than that, back in chapter 1 and verse 14, when we talked about how that Jesus became flesh and dwelt among men, the idea there is literally the word is tabernacle. He tabernacled among us, that dwelt there. He tabernacled among us. Well, what was the tabernacle? It was kind of the forerunner of the temple. It was the place where God met man here on this earth. Okay? So all of that is, again, any other time you might be looking at something, you might say, well, I don't know, maybe we're looking too hard for connections, except for in John, when he tells you that this whole book is about these signs, these things that happen with these deeper spiritual meanings that you need to be looking for. Okay? Are you with me? You with me? This is yes. Johnny's with me. So if Johnny's with me, at least me and you are together, right? All right. So let's get back over here. Let me pull this up and see if I can make this show up again. There we go. Here it comes. And there it is. John chapter 2 and verse 13 is where we're going to begin this evening. Let me, before we get into the temple stuff, let me read for you a couple of quotes that I think are interesting to kind of give you some framework of what we're talking about. Because when we think the temple, I think it's hard for us sometimes to grasp what the temple meant to the Hebrew people in the first century and even before that and after that, but to kind of grasp what the temple is. It wasn't just like a church building. It was really the center of everything that they did. And so here's a couple of quotes that I'll read for. The first is from N.T. Wright. He says, the temple was the beating heart of Judaism. It wasn't just, as it were, a church on a street corner. It was the center of worship and music, of politics and society, of national celebration and mourning. It was also the place where you could find more animals, alive and dead, than anywhere else in Jerusalem. But towering above all these, it was, of course, the place where Israel's God, Yahweh, had promised to live in the midst of His people. It was the focal point of the nation and of the national way of life. And then Warren Wiersbe said this. He said, the condition of the temple was a vivid indication of the spiritual condition of the nation. Their religion was a dull routine. Now listen to this. See if this maybe fits in modern times as well. Their religion was a dull routine presided over by worldly-minded men whose main desire was to exercise authority and get rich. Not only had they had the wine run out of the wedding feast, but the glory had departed from the temple. Remember what he said? That the Word became flesh, dwelt among men, and we beheld His glory. That's what was at the temple, was the glory of God. but he departed from the temple. There was a lucrative business going on at the temple. Foreign money was exchanged for the proper temple currency, high rates. In some cases, the priests were the ones running these businesses. Animals of sacrifice were sold at a premium. What started as a convenience escalated into a for-profit market. Complicating things further was that the Gentiles could only come into this outer court area and would often come to seek truth or wisdom from the priests, but instead they were met with the circus of the marketplace, further complicating their access to God. Which is interesting because remember what the Jews were supposed to be? A light to the people, a light to the world, a light to the nations. And here they've devolved to the point that they're only making it harder for the nations to come to God. Convenience had overtaken reverence. Jesus had had enough. Jesus was declaring war on the hypocritical leaders and condemning a system that only complicated access to God. He was zealous for His Father's house. And he goes on to talk about kind of that idea. But the idea of how they'd made it even more complicated to get to God. We need to make sure that we don't do that as well. But that's kind of what the temple was. It was like, it was such a sacred building in the eyes of the Jews. And so I was trying to think about, and I read a guy today that was talking about how that maybe the best way to describe the way that the Jews looked at the temple is if you combined the White House, the Capitol building, the National Sanctuary, the Smithsonian Institute. He had all these lists of all of these buildings that we would consider in our country our most sacred held places. You put it all together, and that was what the temple was. It wasn't just where they went to offer sacrifices. It was the center of everything. And the idea of God's glory not being there was something that had been problematic for years. And all the way back even into like Zechariah and Malachi, they talked about one of the things, Denny talked about last week about how that there was this gap, 400 years, that God didn't have any communication with the people. And that last piece of information that he gave them in Malachi, you go to chapter 3, and that was one of the big things that he had, chapter 1 and chapter 3 really. But he talks about how that the priests and the Levites, the religious leaders of the people that should have been leading the people closer to God, that all they were doing was trying to make themselves rich and fat off the people. And they had so corrupted the house of God, they corrupted the worship of God, and most importantly, they corrupted the covenant that they made with God in doing so. And that was a problem. And so that's the scene that we have that Jesus is going to walk into. So beginning in verse 13, he says, the Passover of the Jews was at hand. And I've gotten written up there some passages that will kind of maybe stir your memory a little bit. Remember back in chapter 1, verses 29 and 36, when Jesus is called, "Behold the Lamb of God." And we talked about how interesting it was that was what John the Baptizer called him. This idea of being the Lamb of God is going to be repeated. And even more than that, in the Gospel of John, you're going to have all of these references made to the Passover. In fact, if you read through the Gospel of John, there's so many mentions of the Passover, you would almost think that there was about 7 or 8 Passovers that Jesus' ministry spanned, because that's one of the trajectories of the book that you need to see. If you turn over in your Bibles to chapter 11, or in your little John books, chapter 11 of John, ultimately this is where he gets to with this. John chapter 11, takes me a little bit because I didn't have my Bible app pulled up yet. That would help if I would do that before time. John chapter 11, and I want to read verse 30. We'll stop and let's see here. I thought it was 11:35, but 55. That's what I meant. Yeah. 55 of chapter 11. Now the Passover of the Jews was at hand, and many went up from the country to Jerusalem before the Passover to purify themselves. They were looking for Jesus and saying to one another as they stood at the temple, "What do you think? That he'll not come to the feast at all?" Now the chief priests and the Pharisees had given orders that if anyone knew where he was, he should let them know so that they might arrest him. So the trajectory in the book is to talk about the Lamb of God and talk about the Passover that's coming. And then at the end of chapter 11, you've got this, now and it's always the Passover was coming. The Passover was coming. And then here it's the Passover is at hand. Not just the yearly Passover, but this is the Passover. And they're looking for Jesus. And then in chapter 12 and in chapter 13, we're going to see Jesus in those final moments with His disciples and how everything is getting, especially with the raising of Lazarus, the tension is rising. And then the upper room scene in chapters 14 through 7, really chapter 13 through 17. And then Jesus is going to go to the garden. He's going to be arrested. He's going to be crucified. He's going to, at the time of the Passover, He's going to literally be the Lamb of God. Not little L lamb, but big L lamb. Are you with me? And so it's pretty significant when we start seeing this repeated, this idea over and over about the Passover. So the Passover of the Jews was at hand, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. It says in verse 14, in the temple He found two categories of people. Those who were selling oxen and sheep and pigeons, and number two, the money changers sitting there. So the Passover was one of three feasts that Jewish men that were following the law were required to go to Jerusalem for. And of course, the reason that they went to Jerusalem, to the temple for Passover, was to offer a sacrifice to God. So many traveled from far distant places. A lot of times it was not possible, or certainly not convenient, for them to bring their sacrifices with them. And so at some point somebody had the idea of, hey, we ought to try to help these people out. We ought to set up a marketplace where they can buy a sacrifice when they get here. Doesn't that sound like a good thing? That's a great idea. A way that we can minister to other people. That's a good thing. And so they have a variety. You can see the oxen and the sheep and the pigeons, depending on what your economic level was that you could afford to buy for your sacrifice. But it was there for you. And then you have the money changers, because you have people coming from all over, and they have different currencies of money that they use depending on where they lived at the time. But when they got to Israel, and all of that Gentile money that they had would have been considered unclean. So to pay the temple taxes and to buy these animals at the temple, they had to exchange their money for the Jewish shekel. Okay? Just like any time, if you've ever gone on a trip anywhere overseas where they use different money, then you go to, whenever we went to Israel a couple years ago, we went, of course they had told us not to change our money at the airport. They probably told you all that too, because you don't get as good a rate there. So we get to our hotel and we go down to the desk, and I asked the guy, can you exchange some money for me? And he said, well, I could, but if you'll go down to the marketplace, and he told me where there was a couple of different these little stands where they would exchange money for you. He said they'll actually give you a better rate than I can. Well, that's a good man who's trying to not take advantage of me, trying to help me, right? But if you've ever traveled overseas, you know there are people that will try to take advantage of you and not give you a good rate. Well, here again, we've got people saying, we've got our Jewish brethren coming in from all over, and they don't have the right kind of money. And instead of making them run all over trying to figure out a place that they can, what if we set up some money exchange tables so they could easily exchange their money? Isn't that a good thing? Yes. What a wonderful ministry to help people out. You see a need that people have, and then you say, let's help them meet that need. That's awesome. That's what God's people ought to be doing. But sometimes, really good even ministries go bad because we begin to be selfish and think about self. That's what happens here. So they're sitting there, and what had happened is it had become this impossible environment to actually have fair trade on. Because, Danny says, well, I'm raising pigeons. Can I sell some pigeons? Well, you can, but we're going to get 37% of all your sales. So Danny says, well, I can't make a living that way. And we say, listen, they're not going to go anywhere else. We kind of got a monopoly here. So you just charge what you want to. So Danny says, well, I'm going to charge 62% more than I normally do. Give Corey his 37%, and I've made even more money. And then Coach Hollowell comes along, and he says, I've got some oxen. I would love to be involved. Well, yeah, and we're all getting cuts off each other. And, then you've got Alan back here, he's selling pigeons, and Danny's selling pigeons, and I go to Danny and I say, is that the best price you can do? And say, no, I can't do any better. And then he kind of looks over at Alan and gives him the wink, and I go over to Alan, and Alan says, well, mine are 10 cents more a piece than, so I come back to Danny and say, well, it was all just a scam is what it was. And everybody was getting rich off of people trying to worship God and serve Him. That's the problem. It's not that Jesus had a problem with someone being in business. He didn't have a problem with someone making a profit. He didn't have a problem with these stands necessarily trying to help people. The problem was that it was no longer about ministering to people. It was about taking advantage of folks so that I could profit. We've made the house of God, we've made the worship of God, we've made this covenant relationship with God all about me exercising my authority so that I can get rich and fat off of your devotion. Can you see how that'd be a problem? And so when Jesus sees these, verse 15, making a whip of cords, he drove them all out of the temple with the sheep and oxen, and he poured out the coins of the money changers and overturned their tables. And he said to those who sold the pigeons, by the way, Leviticus 5:7, you might write that down. That's where he talks about how that you can offer pigeons if you're very poor. Take these things away. Do not make my Father's house a house of trade. And the idea, again, that's behind this is not that there was a problem with the actual selling of stuff. It was that what was behind what they were doing. See, they had made a mockery and a sham of what it was supposed to be. So Jesus makes this whip of cords, and I mentioned in our introductory class that we had about the Gospel of John, about how that John doesn't necessarily write in chronological order. He's writing to make a point, and because it's interesting that when you read the other Gospels, this cleansing of the temple, as it's often called, is at the end of Jesus' ministry, and it's the event that makes everybody say, all right, we got to stop him. We got to kill him. This has gone too far. But John has it here at the beginning of us telling about Jesus. So why does he put it here? Well, again, he's trying to help us, show us these signs that's going to help us believe that Jesus is the Christ so that we can have life. And in just a minute, I'll talk about why I think that it's inserted here. But the outcome of what happens is really what needs to be focused on. It says, his disciples remembered that it was written, zeal for your house will consume me. That's a quote from Psalm 69 and verse 9. Psalm 69 and verse 9 is a very interesting psalm. It is a psalm that David wrote when he was in very desperate trouble, needed help very badly, and he prays to God for that help. It is a psalm that is very messianic. It's quoted oftentimes in the New Testament and pointing to Jesus, and especially verse 9 because of what happens here. Zeal for my house, or for your house, will consume me. But notice the idea that's in Psalm, and all really through the Old Testament, but the idea that's in Psalm 69 here is that the temple is whose house? It's God's house. But notice who Jesus said the house belonged to. My Father. Who's He putting Himself on par with? God. Well, that's not going to sit well with people, of course. So, verse 18, the Jews said to Him, what sign do you show us for doing these things? And a lot of times, whenever we read this, I've heard a lot of people say, what they're doing is they're asking Him for a sign so that He shows that He has the authority to do the things that He's doing. Actually, the way that the Greek is written is that it really ought to be translated, what sign are you showing us? In other words, you're doing something that is a sign, but what does it represent? What does it mean? So, I mentioned earlier, all of the miracles were signs, but not all the signs were miraculous. Anything miraculous about a cord wound into a whip, turning tables over and driving people out? Anything miraculous about that? Of course not. So this is not a miraculous thing that He's doing, but there's something that has a bigger point, and we'll get to that in just a minute. By the way, those of you that were raised like when I was in the 70s and 80s, and maybe before then, I don't know when they came up with flannel graphs. Someone will tell me probably after a while, but I remember the flannel graphs of Jesus with the whip and on the the light blue flannel thing and it was kind of, for those of you that are too young to remember, it's like the PowerPoint of the 80s. It was really cool for us back then. But I remember that flannel graph, and it was because it doesn't look like what I picture Jesus walking around all the time with His hands folded, and He's very calm, and even as we usually portray Him, somewhat effeminate in the way that He's acting. There's some masculinity right here. You think about all those people that are there think about like when the soybean festival's going on and up and down the streets, you got all of those people that have got their little tents set up selling all of that stuff that's up there, Imagine what kind of I could see Matt Valley taking a cord and running everybody out, but I don't think I could do that. I think somebody would stomp me down and say, you get out of here, buddy, But Matt, they would go running if they saw him charging. But think about what the passion that Jesus is showing here. So the Jews asked Him, what sign are you showing us by doing these things? And Jesus answered them. So here's what the sign is all about. Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up. That's the punchline of this particular sign. Destroy the temple, and in 3 days I'll raise it up. Now, they don't understand the punchline because they're going to attribute it to something other than what it should be attributed to. But Jesus answered them this punchline, and then they say, the Jews said, it's taken 46 years to build this temple, and will you raise it in 3 days? So this is probably about 27 to 33 AD, depending on which calendar you're looking at or whatever. But think about what this means. They've been working on it for 46 years. This is Herod's temple. It's not going to be completed until 64 AD. So we've been working on it for 46 years. We've got somewhere in the neighborhood of another, 36 years-ish, 34 years that we're going to be working on it. And you say you're going to tear it down and rebuild it in 3 days? That would be quite the construction profit check, wouldn't it? Well, that's not going to happen. It'd be like, Bubba saying, well, tear down the library downtown, and in 3 days I'll have it built back. What did you see how long it took to build it the first time? It's not going to be built in 3 days. And so that's what they're focused on, is this building. But, verse 21, He was speaking about the temple of His body. And we could go over to Ephesians chapter 1, and we could go over to 1 Corinthians and talk about how that His body is the church. But the idea that he's talking about really is this body, his physical tabernacle or tent that he's wearing. Tear down this body, and I'm going to build it back in 3 days. Tear down this temple, and I'll build it back in 3 days. Now, what's he pointing to? His crucifixion and his resurrection. See? And so, they don't understand what's happening. The Jews, remember the Jews in John are the people that are opposed to Jesus. Most often it's the religious leaders. They don't understand what he's talking about. But guess who else doesn't understand what he's talking about? The disciples don't understand what he's talking about. Notice what John says. It says, when therefore he was raised from the dead, his disciples remember. John didn't say, and we knew what he was talking about. He said, after the fact, we look back and we said, oh, that's what he was talking about. How many times have you done that as an adult? You think back to something and say, oh, that's what Mom and Daddy were talking about, you know. Well, that's what he's saying here. When he was raised from the dead, his disciples remembered they had said this, and they believed the Scripture and the word that Jesus had spoken. Now, what this sign about the temple and cleansing the temple, what this sign is pointing to is that Jesus is saying, God's done with the way that y'all been doing business. God's done with the way that you've been handling your relationship with Him. There's a new and better thing coming. Okay? Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I'll build it up. And the disciples, whenever they saw that sign, ultimately in John, the greatest of all the signs is going to be the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus. When they saw that sign of Jesus' resurrection, they believed. Now they've already believed because they believed earlier whenever they saw Him change the water to wine. Remember, they beheld His glory and they believed. But it's a growing process, this following Jesus. Okay? So when they saw the sign, they believed. That sounds a whole lot like another important couple of verses in John. What verses would those be? 20, 30 through 31, the purpose statement. That's what the purpose of the signs are, to make you believe. But notice what else it says. When they saw the signs, they believed when they thought about the word that Jesus had spoken. See, that's what we all ought to be doing. The word that He spoke was Psalm 69:9. But that's what we all ought to be doing. You ought not take my word for it. You ought not take any Bible class teacher's for it, or any preacher's word for it, or any commentary's word for it. You need to take what I say and line it up with the text and say, is Corey telling us the truth? If Corey's telling us the truth, then I need to believe it and follow it. If not, I need to pull Corey aside and say, hey, did you know you really messed that up? I gave Coach Hollowell the microphone to do the closing prayer a while ago, and I said, and also, if I mess up something, you can turn that microphone on and correct me. But that's what I need somebody to do, if that's what happens. So they believed the word that Jesus was spoken. And so this idea that's behind the cleansing of the temple, I want us to think about, we've got just a few minutes left, I want us to think about a couple of maybe application questions for us. Number one, is there a table in our life that needs to be overturned? One of the interesting things about the Jewish people is they could see the temple, but they couldn't see. They went to the temple to worship God. And the God that they went to the temple to worship is literally standing right in front of them. Remember what John chapter 1 said He was? The Word was God. We go to the temple to worship God, and He's literally standing right in front of me, and I don't recognize Him. And throughout the Gospel of John, what you're going to see over and over is that people will focus on the signs, they'll focus on the miracles, but they won't focus on the worker of the miracle. the one who's performing the sign. And so even in the minds of the disciples, Jesus is a good teacher, and He's someone from God. And He's someone that if we run out of wine, He's the guy that can help us. And if we run out of bread, that's what's going to happen in a couple of chapters. He can make sure that we get fed. And if there's a storm at sea, then He can make sure that. And if there's somebody that's blind or somebody that's lame, He can heal them. And He's the guy that can do those things. It's the stuff that we want, not the who. And I wonder how many times am I seeing Jesus like I should? Am I following Jesus like I should? Is it possible for me to come to a building to worship God and never focus on the God I'm worshiping? Maybe there's some tables that we need to overturn in our life. And then the second question, am I missing Jesus because I'm focusing on self? That's what these people were doing. Am I missing Jesus because I'm focusing more on the building, the traditions, going through the motions, rather than actually who it is we're there to worship? Are you with me? Sometimes we need to maybe clean some house in our lives and recenter, refocus on what really matters. Because a lot of the things that we think really matter don't really matter. You know, what if this building burned down between now and Sunday? Bring your lawn chairs and we'll worship in the pecan grove. And it'll be just as good. I'm going to tell you a story and then we'll close. Several years ago when we were in Denver, I may have told you a story before, I don't know, but it's one of my favorite worship assemblies we've ever had. Several years ago, there was a weekend where they were giving terrible whiteout, blizzard conditions. They shut down the whole city because it was going to be so dangerous to be out. And we ended up getting not quite as much snow as what they anticipated. When I tell you this, you're going to go, whoa, but in Denver it was a different story. We got about 14 or 16 inches of snow, which would have shut us down, I know, for 3 months. But out there, that wasn't as bad. But anyway, I put on Facebook, because we had a student that lived up in the mountains that had driven down so that he could make it to church if we had church, and he was staying in our guest room with us. And we done decided that our family of 5 and Samuel were going to worship together. And we had a bunch of people in our neighborhood I've been inviting to church, and they hadn't come yet. So I just put on Facebook, we're Facebook friends with several of them, that we were going to worship at such and such time at our house. If you can't get out of the neighborhood and would like to worship with us, come on over. Well, none of our neighbors, unfortunately, came, but about 30 members of Bear Valley got in their vehicles, some of them because they just want to show off what they can do out there, you know, but came over to our house. And we had a worship service. And I had taught a Bible class, and then we had a worship service, and Samuel led singing. I think Garrett preached, and maybe Gordon did the Lord's Supper or whatever, and Gannon was about that tall, and he wanted to do something. And I said, at the very end of the worship service, you can sing the last song. Well, when all the people showed up, he thought I wasn't going to let him. So he's like, Daddy, can I still? And I said, yes, I don't care what they think. You're leading the song, you know. So he leads us in our last song. We had the night before, Melody had made like this chicken tortilla, taco, whatever soup. And with everybody coming over, we thought, well, we need to feed them something. So we just, if you put water in soup, it'll stretch out. So we put a lot of water in the soup, and Melody whipped up a little thing of chili, and she had a big bag of baked potatoes we threw in the oven, and we ordered pizza. Everything was shut down except for the pizza places would deliver, so they delivered pizza. That's what the offering went for that morning. Everybody pitched in together and bought pizza. And it was awesome. And every year when it comes up on our Facebook memories, we all end up texting each other. That's my favorite worship we ever had. Well, we didn't have a fancy building, and we didn't have an official podium, And basically our order of services was, hey, you mind leading opening prayer? Nothing prim and proper. There was no bulletin, We had a plate with those little bathroom Dixie cups that we put some juice in, But it was worship. And I'm not saying there's anything wrong with having a building or having anything nice. I'm just saying if we get so focused on the stuff that we forget the one that we're worshiping, it may be time to clean some tables. You with me? So think about those questions over the next few weeks. We'll finish up with chapter 2 and get into chapter 3 next week. I don't want to go any further because I really think those last couple of verses in chapter 2 belong in chapter 3 more than they do in chapter 2, and we'll talk about that next week. But be reading then to chapter 2 and the rest on into chapter 3 for next week. Let me give you a few updates on our sick list before we have our closing prayer. Rebecca